My guest is Elaine Bunn, and we're here to talk about, Elaine, your long and illustrious career and your involvement specifically in two arms control treaty negotiation processes and outcomes, INF and START. Let's start by, could you provide an overview of your role and responsibilities during both negotiations? Where were you seated and what did you do?
Yeah, my INF history is much longer than my START history. Okay. My INF history began when I was still in graduate school at SAIS, and I was an intern when actually employed, they call them, at the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency from 78 to 80. And so that was the period where NATO SS-20s had already been deployed. Schmidt had already said, I'm concerned. I think we need something to couple us. And we had not yet gotten to, while I was there, we got to the INF dual track decision in NATO. So, but remember, I'm an intern. So, but I did work with people who were very much involved in the negotiations. And I was writing, briefing memos for the director for less important visitors and such. So, Bob Nurek, Lucas Fisher, those people were very much involved, and I was supporting them. Then after graduate school, I became a presidential management, they were then called interns, not fellows, at OSD, and did some rotations, but some of those rotations involved theater nuclear forces, INF, those kinds of things. And then I landed in a permanent job in the Theater Nuclear Forces Policy Office, working for later Ambassador Reed Hamner, but that time he was just a retired colonel director of the office. During that period, a lot of interaction both with allies, and then a stint on the negotiating team, a 6-week stint in Geneva. But mostly my role then was Washington backup, working directions, working cables to the delegation, that sort of thing. Fast forward, that's sort of 81 to 83, 4. And fast forward we'll fast forward to the time when I was working other issues, missile defense issues at the Pentagon and then at National Defense University. But I would tell my kids when we'd go to the Air and Space Museum and there was an SS-20 and a Pershing II, I'd go, Mommy helped get rid of those missiles. Anyway, so I identified with the INF Treaty. Fast forward to 2013, I leave NDU, come back into OSD as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy, where I have oversight for, civilian oversight of nuclear targeting, interagency things, also the INF arms control compliance and New START compliance, because, that's 2013, New START's already been signed, ratified, and so forth. So we're going to fast forward. And then my role was, oh my gosh, that treaty that I worked on early in my career, it's back with me because of the Soviet violations. I'm sorry, the Russian violations. Soviets to Russians during that span. The Russian violations of the INF Treaty and dealing with both the interagency and allies on that.
You mentioned you were at SAIS doing a degree. What was your academic background, and how did your background prepare you for these positions?
My academic background was University of Georgia undergrad you could make up your own major in the 70s. And so mine was international political communications, which was political science and journalism and a little language, French and German. But it was a made up major. But I did do my honors thesis on U.S. Information Agency, information or propaganda.
Wow.
Duh.
Prescient.
Both. Anyway, it sounds so naive now, doesn't it? But then,
I would say it's back again.
I worked for a while in state government and then came back to D.C. where I really wanted to come anyway. Having served as an intern for Senator Sam Nunn in 1974 when he was a very junior senator, And that's probably part of what got me really interested. I got Potomac fever, and I got interested in, he had me going to hearings on NATO, because I wanted to get involved in NATO. and taking notes on hearings and writing that up and that sort of thing. So, I wanted to come back.
Yeah,
and
pretty
so
inspiring.
I did come back in 1977, worked at Congressional Research Service as research assistant to Charlie Gellner in arms control. And then, that was great preparation, because I got to know the acronyms and some of the people and so forth. And that's actually how I got the internship at ACTA, was thanks to Charlie Gellner. And I got that while I was in graduate school at SAIS.
And were you among the only women in the space at the time?
Yeah. Let's see. At ACTA, Jan Nolan was at ACTA then, in a different part of the organization, Conventional Forces. The organization that Lucas Fisher had MBFR negotiations, Mutual Balanced Force Reduction negotiations, that later became CFE, basically. And Jamie Young was part of that, and she was probably in her 40s then. I thought she was so old and so sophisticated. So there were a few women around, but not a lot. Not a lot.
And yet it seems like this is always what you wanted to do. You had a sense at a pretty young age. I wanted to do
international something or other.
Yeah.
Ever since college. And then the happenstance job off a bulletin board at Congressional Research Service was the entree to
how fortuitous
to the nuclear field. Yeah.
Amazing.
Well, and Sam Nunn, and the internship with Sam Nunn. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, let's go back. You mentioned the dual track decision. By the time you were involved in INF, the SS-20s had been deployed. Can you talk about that as a motivating factor to bring both sides to the table?
Yeah. Part of the SS-20s, 3 warheads, could reach all of Europe. Couldn't reach us, but they could reach all of Europe. So they were definitely intermediate range. Less than 5,500, but I don't remember the exact range, but longer. They were longer range INF, and we'll get to that in a minute. And it worried Europe. It worried our NATO allies, who were, I guess, 15 at the time. I guess they were only 15. Because the Spanish didn't come in until 86 or so, 83, 4. Anyway, so it was a much smaller NATO, less than half the size that it is now. And NATO allies were worried. Germany was on the front lines then. There was still a Warsaw Pact. So Germany was on the front lines. Other countries were also worried, but I think Germany was the big motivator for, wait a minute, we're concerned that, a nuclear war could be fought on our territory without the U.S. coming in. And we want that for the deterrence of, there's going to be rapid escalation if nuclear weapons are used. And remember how conventionally inferior we were at that point, too. So they wanted something on their soil, very coupling, that would escalate very quickly. So this was a big issue in NATO in that 77 to 79 period. And I was a bit player on the sidelines at the time, but very much watching it. I did have a little secret clearance so that I could read the cables and I could do all that stuff, and then try to write up memos for people visiting, talking points. INF was a talking point for everybody at the time. Anytime anybody met with anybody, it was INF was part of it. And so lots of talking point memos to be done, even by interns. The lead up to the decision, the idea was we need something to counter this unless they get rid of them. And so that's the idea behind the dual track decision. And it's part of the foundation for now the thinking that deployments in NATO require some kind of arms control proposal too. I'm not sure. I think some people were hopeful that the Soviets would give up their SS-20s. It was different people had different views of how far we could get in these negotiations. Some, maybe my boss Richard Pearl, thought, nah, we just need the arms control side to get the deployments done. Others, probably an active thought, no, we can really reduce the SS-20s, and maybe we'll actually deploy too. And then, there may have been some far-thinking people even early on who thought, we can get to complete elimination. My thought is that the 0-0 proposal originally, few people thought it would actually come to fruition.
Yeah. And it had been kind of part of the conversation for many years at that point, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Began before Reykjavik.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Long before 86.
Could you unpack that any arms control proposals and deployments go together? Can you talk about that dynamic?
Well, part of it is because our allies are democracies. Thank goodness. And oh dear, that adds another wrinkle in that they all have parliaments, national assemblies, named differently in different countries, but they all have legislatures, and they all have public opinion matters, and they stand for election. And so there was a lot of anti-nuclear feeling in Europe, and yet those in government and positions of responsibility really felt like we had to do something to address the SS-20s. Yes, the Soviets had many other nuclear weapons, but this one, MIRVed, reach all of Europe. It's just really
frightening.
Yes, it was really frightening. Yeah. So, very accurate. That idea that there were going to be big debates in their countries, I think a number of Allied governments felt like they needed it for public. They also were in that. We're worried about the Soviets, but we also don't want to poke a big stick in their eyes. We live next to them, so we want to be careful how we do this. So I think for a number of NATO nations, it was if we're going to do these deployments, we need arms control. For some of them, it was we need arms control, and if that means we have to have deployments, okay. And for others, it was we need the deployments, and that means we have to have arms control. Okay.
Interesting. So from both perspectives, the dual track was necessary for both sets of proponents.
Yeah. Now, did I know that at the time? I was studying this. I was writing papers on it in graduate school. I was reading cables during the daytime during my 32-hour-a-week part-time job. But part of this comes to me later.
Okay.
Having dealt with allies for 40 years.
Mm-hmm. Can you recall any particularly contentious or memorable moments during those negotiations that you witnessed or were privy to somehow?
Yeah. There was the walk in the woods. Nitz's walk in the woods with the Soviet ambassador negotiator, which kind of hit Washington like a ton of bricks when he wrote in it. That was eyes only and very small groups of people. But it was clear to me as a GS 11, 12, something was going on.
That had a big impact.
And there was, and Elaine, there's something going on. We can't read you in, but you kind of figure out what's, and it was very clear that that the Defense Department was not happy with what Ambassador Nitze had discussed.
Interesting. And
I can't recall, I really don't recall how State and Rick Burt were reacting to it at the time. But Nitze was a very senior statesman, very senior, with doing post-World War II bombing studies. He'd been an assistant. He was a very well-respected. He'd done the Nitze School. I was a beneficiary of his grants to the Nitze School, but there was certainly at the Defense Department, there's a lot of unhappiness with the walk in the woods. Other periods that I remember personally, for instance, when we went to Greenham Common, where some ground-launched cruise missiles were going to be deployed. It was under construction. It was during that period. It was probably, 82 or 83. And we had been there for some meetings. It wasn't just to go look at Greenham Common, but we'd been there for some meetings and thought, we really should, let's go see. There's some people with us who were on the deployment side too. So they wanted to see how the construction was coming along. And so we went to Greenham Common. We have our little car that I'm sure the embassy had put us in to take us up to Greenham Common. And there are the ladies of Greenham Common camped outside.
Huh.
And I just remember being in the back seat at a window and seeing all the signs held up to the window and then seeing women spitting on the car.
Huh.
Yeah. Depends on who I talk to. One of my bona fides is, yes, I was spat upon by the ladies of Greenham Common.
And the ladies of Greenham Common were no nukes in my backyard.
Yeah. Yes. And so that was one that really stuck with me. There were, obviously, the tensions between state and defense at that time were very high. The Richard Pearl dynamics were, I think a book's been written on it. Interesting way to start your civil service career.
Yeah, right in the thick of it.
And yet, Steve Pfeiffer, later Ambassador Pfeiffer, Ambassador to Ukraine and stuff, Steve Pfeiffer and I were AOs who were, at 8 p.m., we were trying to clear the cables, the guidance cables going out. We had a great working relationship.
Yeah.
Our bosses didn't, but we did.
INF was negotiated pretty quickly. Talk about what we can attribute that to.
Pretty quickly. Well, 80 or 81. It started in the Carter administration, didn't it?
It started in the Carter administration.
Yes, but after 79, it took a little while to get the negotiations going, but by 80 they were going. So then they went until 83, till December of 83, when the U.S. actually started deploying.
Right.
I remember that phone call. I remember, I guess it was the airplane or the cargo plane that was carting stuff in called our deputy director. I was there with him that evening when they said, it's a go. We've gotten the go to go. And so we were at the office late that evening. And so the Soviets then did walk out of the negotiations in December of 83 when the deployments began. And it took until it took a year and a half. So it took until 85 for them to start again. So then 85 to 87. So I'm not sure that 1980 to 1987 is that quick.
No, I would measure it from the end of Reykjavik.
Okay. So if you're going to go October of 86 to
talking about eliminating intermediate range, Gorbachev and Reagan sit down at Reykjavik. They have this incredibly expansive and freewheeling conversation. They talk about eliminating all nuclear weapons.
Yes.
Then the talks fail over SDI. They both walk away from the table, and everyone retreats.
Yes.
And then talks resume. Once talks resumed, they went pretty fast.
They did. You're right. The end game went pretty fast.
Yeah. Could you tell me about that?
No, because in October of 86, I had my first child.
Okay.
I remember my deputy assistant secretary coming to visit with his wife and also little daughter, talking about Reykjavik while I was on maternity leave.
Oh.
And then I went back to the Pentagon and then worked SDI.
Okay.
And worked missile defense and cooperation with allies and that sort of thing. So no, I can't tell you about that end game.
Okay. What was that like, taking maternity leave in the Pentagon as a young woman?
I have to tell you that even 20 years later, people would look at me and go, "Oh, you look so slim." And that's because they first met me when I was, 8 months pregnant. It was very strange, especially, I do remember one episode there where I was 8 months pregnant and I was briefing a group of Japanese journalists because of the MOU we were negotiating with Japan on cooperation on missile defense, research and development. Just research and development at the time. And we were all sitting around in the assistant secretary's office. There was a low coffee table. So my gray jumper and gray jacket that I had made, which I thought looked very professional, but were sticking out to here. I was talking along, and all these journalists were taking notes. And all of a sudden, I saw their pens stop. And they were like this. And it's because that's when Anna decided to go from this side to this side. And so it was like this big gray. That's when I felt like, and Japanese journalists were not used to dealing with women a whole lot in the 80s, much less pregnant women.
Right.
So, yeah, you felt it.
And how much leave did you take?
4 months that time.
Okay.
And remember, it was 6 weeks of sick leave.
Yeah.
And if you had enough annual leave, you could take that. And after that, it was unpaid leave.
Yeah.
So there was no maternity leave. Yeah.
Yeah. And then what was it like coming back after maternity leave?
Well, I remember going away. I was doing cooperation with both the Israelis and the Japanese at that time. The Israelis, we started, because I said, when they gave me this portfolio, when I moved offices and they gave me this portfolio, I said, well, okay, I haven't told many people, but, in October, I'm going to be gone for a while. And they went, oh, these will be done by then. Okay. Well, the Israelis, you can imagine, wanted this agreement really badly because this was the cooperation on Arrow and things that became Iron Dome and so forth. Mm-hmm. They wanted this agreement. And so that negotiation took 2 weeks. I was done long before I went on maternity leave. The Japanese, and this is before 96 when the missile flew over Japan from North Korea. That took 2 years. So I was doing it before I left.
Yeah.
As my belly was going from side to side. And I was doing it when I came back.
Okay.
So, at least the portfolio had stayed the same.
Okay. Yeah. Not always the case for everyone.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. Well, back to INF. So once everyone returned to the negotiation table, the talks went pretty quickly. There were a lot of technical challenges associated with verification. Could you talk about those?
Yeah, I remember. Well, we had a separate office that worked the verification. Sally Horn, you should also interview, worked on the verification procedures, and I remember working with her about that and on that. But it was all the, how do you get rid of these things? How do you make sure that the factories that have been making these things don't continue making them? How do you both get rid of and make sure there are no new ones? And so there was an inspection regime. And I should remember this, how long the inspection regime lasted. But I do know that when I came back to the Pentagon in 2013, it was over. Yeah. And there was no more inspection regime. After we were both countries were satisfied that both had eliminated all ground-based INF, long-range INF and short-range INF down to 500.
I think it was 2003.
Lips. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. When I was at NDU. So.
Somebody else's problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was negotiated pretty quickly. Verifications were a challenge, and there was a whole team devoted just to negotiating verification on-site inspection. Yeah. There was a dispute over which sites would be included at some point, but ultimately the agreement to eliminate all ground-based intermediate range nuclear weapons or delivery devices.
Missiles
was
conventional and nuclear. Right.
Okay. So tell me more about getting to that specific category. My apologies.
To the INF category? We were worried about the SS-20. NATO was worried about the SS-20. But also some of the shorter range systems. Yeah. And so I do remember sitting in my office on the phone with Steve Pfeiffer saying, how are we going to distinguish between these ranges? So there's long-range INF and short-range INF, but there's longer-range, short-range nuclear forces, and there's shorter-range. So we had about 3 categories. Yeah. And so the negotiators were working off, okay, exactly which missiles are we worried about? Yeah. We were going, which of theirs are we worried about most? which ones do we think we can negotiate on? And I'm sure they were doing the same thing. What are they worried about on the U.S. side? And so, I don't recall how we got to the 500 kilometers. You can't have anything 500 kilometers or up.
Yeah.
Because we both did. We both had things below that range, and we certainly wanted to capture the SS-20. They certainly wanted to capture the Glickam and the Pershing II.
And the treaty is very specific. It enumerates very specific missiles and their locations.
Right, it does. Yeah.
That was a lot of information
locations, their manufacturing locations. Yeah. So
unprecedented level of transparency.
And unprecedented level of verification. Yeah.
So 2003, everything is eliminated, verified, and
no more on-site inspections.
No more inspections, and the Special Verification Commission effectively disbands.
Right, there's nothing to do.
Which would later be kind of post hoc invoked to resolve a dispute.
Right.
Talk about the treaty implementation post elimination, and is there a consensus on what folks would have done differently looking back?
Because I really come back into the picture in 2013.
Okay. We'll talk about it from the 2013 perspective.
Okay.
There are inklings of Russian violations,
right, and
trickling out into the public.
Very highly classified.
Yeah.
Very highly classified. And it's a very small group within the U.S. interagency that is even aware of this. And there's is there some other explanation for this? Is there, we see what became known as the SSC-8. We saw that they were doing things. Intelligence was, kept briefing the people who were involved, but it was very highly classified. And so the question in the interagency was, is there some other explanation for this? Did they make a mistake? Did somebody just not follow procedure? Did somebody, did the developers do something that, if it were us, the compliance review group, the CRG, which I sat on for a while, that looks at every program the U.S. might undertake, that DoD might ever undertake, that has any possible treaty implications for any existing treaty. And oh my God, it's scrubbed with a toothbrush. I mean, finer than that. And so, if they had something like a compliance review group, is it the kind of thing that just never got briefed to the CRG? Because it would have been cut off. So in other words, is there some other explanation? Are they willfully doing these things? Or is this, some random guy in the R&D community who isn't following the rules? What's going on? So there was that debate internally. Then it became, as evidence keeps coming out and it becomes clearer and clearer that something's going on, and we brief Congress a classified basis, and then it comes out in the compliance review report, the unclassified review,
the annual
in
report.
2014. Is that correct?
I think so.
And then we start getting questions from lots of people. The Hill wants to have hearings on it. That's great. You can have unclassified hearings, but you can't go into very much detail.
Yeah.
You can, you go brief allies. So lots of briefings to allies. This is what we are seeing. This is what we think the implications are. We think they're violating the INF Treaty.
Yeah.
And we had, because of the classification of the evidence and the sources and methods involved, we couldn't share how we knew this even with allies.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
there's one ally we share a whole lot with.
Yes.
But in general, we couldn't share it with even allies at the TS level. It was very compartmented.
Yeah.
Because of sources and methods. And there are allies who are very dubious.
Interesting.
If you can't show me the evidence, why can't you, Show me the evidence.
Because they were so trusting of the Russians, or they didn't want to believe it, or they didn't want a problem in their backyard?
Because of, the bag of sugar. I think because of Iraq yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think 2003. And I think
the burden of proof was on the United States.
The burden of proof was on us.
Yeah.
Because they weren't just going to take it, well, we've got intel that we can't share with you.
Right.
They weren't taking that
Right.
anymore.
Fool me once.
Right.
Yes.
So we had a whole lot of back and forth meetings, a lot of my trips then they were either to assure allies on extended deterrence dialogues, or they were on the Russian violation of the INF treaty. That was a lot of the travel I did, was to go. And then here in the U.S., we had several roundtables that we held with think tanks. And they had all these great ideas about, well, really, don't you think this is really like, maybe they were really testing a slickum, and and that would be okay under the INF treaty. And you just had to say, no, we considered that alternative. That's not what's going on. But you couldn't share very much. It was very frustrating.
And I imagine this whole time, the U.S. is approaching Russia and saying, could you please talk to us?
Oh, yes. Rose Godmueller's. We were back and forth with the Russians. Mm-hmm. And primarily what they want to know is, how do you know that? What's your evidence? I mean, I think they thought there was anyway, I am still unclear what I can say.
Yeah.
And therefore, I'm not going to say a whole lot. But I think they were pressing to figure out what we knew and how we knew it. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure they were doing investigations in their own country. I know that the Trump administration did end up declassifying some things.
Okay.
But and convincing allies. Okay. I don't know exactly, though. Again, I am not comfortable enough with what I can and can't say.
Yeah.
So, but eventually, allies were convinced that the Russians were violating the INF treaty. Mm-hmm. I mean, even after they were deploying the SSC-8.
Yeah.
Because I tend to refer to it as the SSCX-8 mm-hmm. Because it was experimental for a long time during the period of 13 to 16. But eventually, it was pretty clear that they had deployed it. And then it became, how do we know they tested this in such a way that was so? But now I think it's much more accepted and believed by allies that the Russians, and it's clear to me. I mean, I have no doubt.
Yeah.
But that they violated the INF treaty, and it was, for me, it was this thing that I worked on at the beginning of my career, this thing that I was so proud to tell my kids, Mommy helped get rid of those missiles. It was just, I was angry about it.
Sure.
I was angry about it.
A lot of people were.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a strong INF community.
Yes, there is.
Too.
Yes.
A very proud accomplishment. People mm-hmm. who devoted years to the process, mm-hmm. spent, months on end in Geneva, a really tight-knit group.
Yeah. Well, we knew that there were those in the Russian military who never liked the fact. I mean, we heard it from 87 on that there were those who didn't like it. I'll wait for your other questions before.
I was going to say, tell me more about the Russian perspective on the INF treaty.
No, I mean, I was in the negotiations just for one session in Geneva, in the 82-83 period. Anyway, 6 weeks in Geneva, face to face with the Russians, hearing what those people in the delegation that I was coordinating guidance for, what they were hearing and what I was reading in their reporting cables too. So there I did feel, there being a woman really did. I felt, I think I was the only. We may have had a CIA person. A woman. Anyway, on the Russian side, nobody. And they had a negotiating I swear it's a negotiating tactic, which was the first person who has to get up and go to the bathroom. I swear they didn't drink for a day before they went into these negotiations because they could just sit there and talk and talk and talk for hours and hours and hours on end. Not eat, not drink, not not go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
And so I adopted after the first day when, by golly, as a younger woman, I wasn't going to be the first one to have to get up and go to the bathroom.
For sure.
So then I just restricted
your intake
greatly.
And if you got up to go to the bathroom, that was it. You ceded some ground.
It was an unspoken
Toughness.
contest almost.
Yeah.
Yeah. Silly.
All right. So INF treaty violations are coming into focus, and New START has just been signed, and there is a huge push to get it ratified on the Hill. Can you talk about the intersection of those two?
The huge push to get New START ratified was 2010.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. And I mean, I heard about it. I read about it, but I wasn't involved in it.
Okay.
I was at NDU when then Vice President Biden came over and did the big speech on the modernization program, which was part of the effort.
Yes.
Which the timing of it, I would say, was part of the effort to get New START ratified. Again, deployments for arms control, right? But that had more to do with the Senate.
Okay.
And getting those who were dubious about, who weren't particularly supportive of New START, to, okay, you get this, you get the modernization program,
bargaining chip.
Yeah.
Throughout our conversation, there's kind of you've alluded to sort of tensions between state and DoD, which you seem to have had to manage quite often. Can you talk about what those tensions are, particularly when it comes to nuclear weapons and their deployment, and tools of the trade for managing?
Personalities matter, and how much of a fight there is depends on who's between Rick Burt and Richard Pearl. It was a big clash. I would say, 2013 to 2016, when I came back to Defense Department as DASD, we had differences of views sometimes on how best to do this or do that. And, you'd struggle over words and talking points and that sort of thing. But it wasn't the deep divide that you saw. So personalities do matter.
Yeah.
And my view is that state is doing its job and defense is doing its job. The role of the state, they are the diplomats. They are the leads and delegations. Defense is saying, okay, from a national security, military defense perspective, what things are we trying to protect and what things are we most worried about that we'd like to get rid of, and how do we get there?
Yeah.
Remember in 2010, before many negotiations, there was even after the nuclear posture review, there was another review that was the nuclear posture review. In essence, the first part of it was what forces do we need to carry out presidential guidance? The president gives the guidance on nuclear weapons employment. So what do you need if deterrence fails to meet the objectives that any president spells out? That is kind of DOD's role in there. So both policy and combatant commands, especially STRATCOM, Joint Staff, they are looking at what do we need to protect if the Russians are at this level or if they're at this level, how much difference does it make? How do the targets you need to be able to hold at risk change? And so those big studies need to be done before you go negotiate the agreement. And so that was part of what was going on with New START. Both what do we need to retain? What can we get rid of? What would we really like to see the Russians do with their force structure? What are we most worried about? Those kinds of things. That's DOD's role. And yes, there's a state input into that, but it's kind of like who does the first draft?
Yeah.
For that, DOD has to do the first draft. For for what's the negotiating position going to be. That's kind of state drafts that. Mm-hmm. And so together you have to get to a negotiation. So I see it as each is doing is taking the role, is carrying out its mission appropriately. And yes, your perspective is different from mine because we have different roles. And that's fine.
Yeah.
And then you have to, usually it should be the NSC that says, okay, is everybody getting a voice? Including IC, how do you see this? What do you see going on? But not, what do you think the policy should be, or what should the negotiating strategy be? That's not their role. So I see state and defense as carrying out their role. And if you can disagree without being a jerk, and then get to some kind of position, U.S. government position, that's what you should be doing.
You've won.
Yeah.
Yeah. Today, there's a lot of tension between those who think we need all the nuclear weapons for deterrence, and this sort of contrived divide between those who believe in deterrence and those who believe in arms control. Where do you think that came from, and should those concepts be so distinct from one another?
Having done both in my career, I've worked arms control, I've worked deterrence, both in NATO, extended deterrence, U.S. deterrence, U.S. reviewing targeting plans for civilian oversight up to the SecDef. So I've done both in my career. And I think my view is that certainly in defense, the organization should be such that those who work the arms control aspects should also be the same people who work, certainly at the DASI level, who work the deterrence and what do we need for deterrence piece? And what do we need for allied assurance? And they should be the same. They should be in the same organization. Mm-hmm. There should not be two separate offices for that. State, I want my arms control people. I love it when my arms control people have some experience in that. I can think of a couple of people who worked in my office as IPAs, either from a lab or from a think tank, doing the deterrence side, and then went over to state and worked in the arms control organization there.
Yeah.
I think that's great. I think a lot of times people spend their careers doing only one or the other. Yeah. And I think that's where the us against them comes in. For U.S. national security, both are important, right? And they're not either or. As I say, I think the basis of, arms control positions have to be, wait, what does the security environment look like? What does the president tell us we need to be able to do to deter, and if deterrence fails? What do we need to do to assure allies? All those have to be factored into your arms control proposals. Yeah. If they're not, you get nervous allies, you get, the joint staff saying, no, we don't, no, Senator, I don't agree with this. So, I think they need to work together. And if you can work a career where you do some of each, much better. You appreciate the complexities of both.
That's great advice. Well, fast forward to today. The United States is on track to deploy a new nuclear system, the SLICM-N. Could this be en route to a second dual-track phenomenon? Is this, in your view, contributing to deterrence effectively? How could it be deployed in ways that are stabilizing? Do you have thoughts?
First, you said a word that is one of my... What does stabilizing mean? It is one of those terms that too often people use it as, I'm doing this, therefore it's stabilizing. You're doing something I don't like, therefore it's destabilizing. I think it does mean something, but it's really hard to pin down once you get past first strike stability. Okay, and most people don't use it just to mean that. Crisis stability is much harder to measure. Arms race stability, those are the three classic versions. Does it mean all of those? What does it mean? some people use it just in a vacuous way. So, is it stabilizing or not? I don't know. What's your definition of stability? But that's just one of my little bugaboos.
Yeah.
Having tried to, for instance, in 2015 or so, when the 2010 NPR had said we're going to discuss strategic stability with the Chinese, because obviously to figure out together what it means in our relationship, because obviously it means something different than it did in the U.S.-Soviet then U.S.-Russian relationship. And the USG was trying to figure out what issues, which aspects of strategery, as I put it, we all now know about integrated deterrence, and it's nuclear and conventional and cyber and space and information, and it's everything. Okay, so which aspects of that contribute or detract from stability were we going to discuss with the Chinese? How broadly or narrowly did we want to define this term? And let me tell you, OSD and the Joint Staff couldn't even agree. And it's not that we didn't get along. It's just that, two different people writing papers, we couldn't even get it to the interagency because DOD couldn't agree on how narrowly or how broadly to define it. Is SLCM stabilizing? We've had it before. We'll have it again, probably. It's now a program of record. I was dubious of it, and then I became we probably should deploy it. Partly why? Partly for deterrence reasons. I don't know if the Russians think we don't have appropriate responses if they used short-range or intermediate-range nuclear weapons, even in a Ukraine scenario, but certainly in a NATO scenario. Do they believe that we're sort of hamstrung, that we would be paralyzed because we don't have appropriate responses or not? Now, do we or do we not have appropriate responses? Okay, when LRSO comes out, is that appropriate or not? Some would say, well, but air defenses, Russian air defenses, or Chinese air defenses would make that not as viable as, great, B-6112, well, their air defenses and even bigger problem for
and all our
F-35 for a while may be able to do it, but not indefinitely. Our delivery systems get better, their air defenses get better, our delivery. So this is a constant. This happens. Do I call that an arms race? I just call that's the progression of technologies, right? So SLCM may deter an adversary from believing that we don't have an appropriate response, maybe. But it's always, I guess if budgets were unlimited, I'd say, it's always good to have more on this side of the scale than not. So maybe it helps deter. So let's put it over there to help deter. Do allies? I haven't heard. Yes, you can always find someone in an allied nation who goes, I think that's the answer. But certainly allied governments have not spoken up like the Germans did in 1977 and said, no, we need something here. And SLCM is the answer. You will hear some allied experts say that, but I haven't heard governments say that. But might it? They're beginning to think, more allies are beginning to think, well, does this add something to extended nuclear deterrence? Do I think a president might be more likely to use this in my defense than an ICBM or an SLBM? These are all about perceptions, and there's no absolutely yes or absolutely no to it. So,
is SLCM a potential bargaining chip? What could you see the United States bargaining it away for?
Mattis talked about it when it first came out in the 2018 NPR. Mattis made some comment about, could be negotiating leverage, or it could be a bargaining chip. Don't recall which term he used, And then others said, oh, no, this is something we need. We're not going to bargain it away. All the Russian short-range nuclear forces, but then what about the Chinese dual-capable systems? Which one of them is really worried about it, and who could you entice into negotiations with it? We laughed at one point during the INF violation period. How could you get the Russians to be serious about this, to be serious about talking about what they were doing with the SSCX-8 at the time? And some of us said, well, why don't we on the LRSO office, why don't we just hang a sign that says it's an air-launched cruise missile, sea-launched cruise missile, ground-launched cruise missile. It's just a cruise missile that we could deploy however we might in the future.
If we're playing games
and it's just
ranges.
R&D, it's R&D. It's not, at that point it was just R. And so pointing to, well, we might consider doing the kind of things that you're doing.
Yeah.
If you're not careful. And we couldn't get that through the interagency. But so
shocking.
So will Slickum be useful in this? I don't know. Depends on how it's used. Would we want to give it up? If we think, this is what I said when I had to testify before Congress in this in 23, I think. Look, if we think we need this for our own security, then we should go forward with it. But we should be clear in our own heads why we think we need this, and not either for negotiating line, and not because, the allies are asking for it, because I haven't heard allies asking for it. Let's not pin it on the allies. Let's decide whether this is in our security interest or not.
Is it a step backward for the long project of arms control?
A step backwards? No. Look, no. No, because Slickum-In's never been part of arms control. But if it is in the future, well, that might be a step forward for arms control, right? I mean, again, from which perspective are you looking at this from? But no, I wouldn't call it that. I'm curious. What's the argument for it's a step back in arms control? Because it's a new now system.
New nuclear system. The long project of arms control was for the NPT, make continual progress towards disarmament. Yeah. This is moving in the opposite direction.
Yeah. So are Chinese deployments, and so are the Chinese buildup. I mean, we tend to think of, yes, a lot of people do think of arms control as one way. Remember when we had treaties back in the early SALT days that were limits to which it built up?
Yeah.
It hasn't always been, reduction. Sometimes it's a cap.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's
And sometimes it's a hotline agreement or
sometimes,
information sharing.
Sometimes it's risk reduction. Sometimes it's incidents at sea agreements. Sometimes it's,
Let's talk about missile defenses and your work on that topic.
Okay.
First, tell me in what capacity you worked on missile defense.
So I first worked on it in, goodness.
Do you want me to circle back?
We're really doing history now. Well, it had to be pre-86 because I was working on the SDI MOUs of cooperation with allies before 86 when my daughter was born. So must have been 85. Must have been 85 because then I went to the compliance office in OSD like in 84, 85. And then somehow I got to the office that Kent Stansberry ran doing space and missile defense. And I was doing I was on the missile defense side, and it was that would have been in the late Reagan and early George H.W. Bush administrations that I was working missile defense. And so a lot of what I did was, so when I was working compliance, we did do some ABM treaty compliance issues. That was when Krasnoyarsk radar, we were doing the Krasnoyarsk radar. And I remember Mark Schneider going, yeah, but it's just going to the interagency and tell them that the power aperture radar is 70, whatever the number was. And I was like, Mark, I don't know what that means, and the folks at State and the NSC are not going to know what that means. Explain, please. So anyway, it was...
So tell us what it means.
Yes, exactly.
No.
You tell me. I have no idea what it means. It meant that what they were building was
Russians.
over what the Russians were building at Krasnoyarsk was over the power aperture radar limits of the ABM Treaty. That's what it meant.
Yeah.
So I did that for just a little bit. So I had a little bit of that
a potential
ABM
violation.
Right.
How was it resolved? Do you remember?
I wasn't working this issue anymore when it was resolved.
No, we can move on.
Did they tear it down? I think they tore it down, didn't they? I think they got rid of it. But anyway, this is what happens. See, when you work too many arms control things and you work them for a while and then you move on to something else and then you move on to something else. So going from MBFR to INF to ABM Treaty to start. Then I went to the office that worked. ABM Treaty Interpretation. Also did that. I spent time in the archives. And that was also for Freddie Clay. That would have been in the Reagan administration. That would have been 87, I think. Working on remember the broad and narrow interpretation of the ABM Treaty? Yeah. Well, Abe Sofer at the Department of State, and I was Dave Stevens was a PMI, and we were sent over. I was, I don't know, I was probably 15 by then. I was sent over to the National Archives to look through all the records of the ABM treaty negotiations to see, really, what did we say? What did the Russians say?
Explain for the students watching this video. What's
the broad versus the narrow interpretation of the ABM treaty. It centered on the term other physical principles. So, the ABM treaty limited the technology that existed at the time in 72, ground-based interceptors. But when it came to technology was going to move forward, and so what should we do about missile defenses that weren't based on rockets on the ground? What should we do about that? They carved out this phrase about other physical principles, and you could do R&D on it, but you couldn't. Anyway, how far could you go on work on other physical principles? And of course, at that time, we'd been sold a bill of goods. The government Reagan had been sold a bill of goods about lasers in space, that somehow they were going to work. And so we were going forward with we wanted to go forward with missile defense based on space-based lasers. That was the original SDI. And it was going to make ballistic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, impotent and obsolete. Yeah, right. Well, all ballistic missiles, impotent and obsolete. That was the 83 SDI speech. And so here we are in 87 trying to go find out what the negotiating record really is on other physical principles. And some said, oh, no, that's not allowed. And others said, oh, no, that's not so clear based on the negotiating record. So that's what I was sent to find the smoking gun. There were no smoking guns. There was some enlightenment, but Peter Sullivan, he was the lawyer in defense who was working on that. And so,
what did he think?
Well, he was trying to justify what
Reagan wanted to do.
The Reagan administration and Cap Weinberger wanted to do at the time. So, he was looking for how can we move forward with lasers in space. This is what comes from being a civil servant. So I was a civil servant for most of my career, and only in my last job was I a political appointee in the end of the Obama administration. Tell
me about that. Let's shift to that.
Oh, being a civil servant?
Tell me about your political appointment.
Oh, the political appointment came because I was at NDU at the time. They were losing a DASD. Brad Roberts was leaving, and by then Michelle Florno was gone. It was Jim Miller who said, they talked to me before the Obama administration about various jobs. But my husband died the week before, 2 weeks before the inauguration, his inauguration. So I didn't go in. I stayed at NDU then. So, but 2013, they were looking for a DASD. And so Jim said, can you come? And I said, sure. Is it political or civil service? And he said, we could do either. Because I'd been SES, before, senior executive service before. And and I said, so what's the fastest way to get me there? Political appointment. Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. So I took a political appointment.
Okay.
And I don't regret taking one for Obama at all.
Yeah.
As a civil servant, all those years going from Carter to Reagan to George H.W. Bush to Clinton to George W. Bush to Obama, my last one. I could, as a civil servant, I could work for all those people. It's as I told incoming presidential management interns who would come and talk to me because I was the last living intern in the Pentagon at some points. I'd go, if you have such strong views on a topic that you're working on that you cannot get up in the morning and look yourself in the mirror and feel good about and go and do your job and make the arguments that you need to make in the building and the interagency to an international audience, then you need to quit. This civil service life isn't for you. But if your attitude is, this isn't what I would do if I were king or queen, but I'm not, and this is the way our political system works, and it's within the reasonable middle. This isn't exactly what I'd do. I'd probably do this instead, but okay, I can go make that argument. I had people say that to me in the INF world back early in my career. They would say in an interagency meeting, Elaine, you can't really believe that. And I say, if you want my personal views, let's go have pizza and beer, and I'll tell you what they are. This is the OSD position.
Yeah.
And here's why. So that's what being a civil servant is.
Tell me
being
about
a political appointee is very different. You're working for the president. But having spanned both of those, I probably had more of a civil servant outlook than a political outlook, even as a political appointee.
Interesting.
All those people I worked with in all those administrations, most of them didn't know whether I was D or R. I had both of them ask me to come to the NSC to do, to do a rotation at the NSC. Just never worked out in my life.
Yeah.
I was pregnant with this one. Yeah, it didn't work out.
Complicated.
For various reasons, yeah.
Tell me about what was in your portfolio as DASD.
As DASD. Touched on some of it. We certainly had the arms control implementation for INF and New Start. We had, I talk about this in terms of we had the portfolio was within OSD. It was within the Pentagon. It was with bigger DOD and the combatant commands. It was the interagency. It was international. Somewhere in there is Congress. It was Congress. It was international. So you were dealing with all those audiences on issues of implementation for INF and New Start, oversight, nuclear weapons guidance, and civilian oversight of targeting. One of the really important roles of that job, I think. Civilian oversight of the military, well, it happens in the nuclear world as well. And so that office is the one that got down in the nitty-gritty reviewing plans. And then if there was something that we thought needed to be pushed up the chain to the SecDef, then we did that. But mostly it was a back and forth with Strat and, explain why this and why not that, and, oh, wait a minute. So how does this implement the guidance document? And the guidance would be presidential, SecDef, joint staff guidance, and then over to StratCom. So that was one of the roles. And that also meant being in on the plans reviews that a different office did, but they reviewed all the conventional plans, but they were in AORs where we had nuclear armed adversaries. And so, I was always the one who said, that's a great conventional plan. what happens if they use a few nuclear weapons? So that was my role there too. It was for both nuclear and missile defense. It was testifying before Congress on programs and the policy aspects of programs. So the modernization program, making sure that it was moving along, the missile defense. What do we need? What is the administration's policy on missile defense? We helped develop it, and then we helped implement it. It was both ways. And that meant dealing with allies. It meant doing negotiations back when we were trying to come to some agreement with the Russians on, or at least make them understand where we were on missile defense. Going to negotiations on that. Most of the ones I went to are in New York with Antonov and Jim Miller and Antonov. But those ended, I guess, 2014, I think, was the last of those. So both on the missile defense and nuclear side, testifying before Congress, I testified four times in 6 weeks before Congress during the 2014 budget cycle. That was one of those where being a political appointee made a difference because I would be testifying with Admiral this and General that and me. And so usually the way the hearing went was, General, thank you so much for your service to our country. Admiral, you've made such a difference in this program. Thank you so much to you and your family. Ms. Bunn, why is this the lowest missile defense budget since, the Clinton administration? Yeah, that's what testifying before Congress is. And if it's House, Senate, open or closed, it made a big difference. Open or closed, actually, so it was more times than 4 because it was 4 in open session and more in closed session. Closed session, there was a lot less posturing. A lot less posturing by Congressmen.
That makes sense.
So,
What is there one particular lesson you would like the next generation of would-be arms controllers to know? What is the most poignant arms control lesson learned for you?
Besides so one of them I've already stated, which is the arms control and deterrence pieces. They come together. It's not one or the other. Obviously I see it because I spent more of my career at defense than at state, but I see it as, you need to figure out what do you need for national security. If there is no arms control, if there is arms control, so under various scenarios, what do you need? And then you go into the negotiations knowing that as a country, we are trying to protect this, do that. If there's an opportunity, then you bring it back and you go, okay, if this, then, and you work it that way. But working them together is so important. I guess the other is that some people forget when it comes to arms control, especially when allies are not directly involved in the negotiations, is when we're negotiating over their heads. It is so important. They've got an interest in this. It affects their security. INF was a great example, but don't forget that it's all our nuclear forces that provide extended nuclear deterrence. It's not just the intermediate, medium, and short-range nuclear forces that provide that. It's all of our nuclear forces. So all of the negotiations, be they, SALT, START, New START, all those, INF, anything having to do with non-strategic nuclear forces, CFE and BFR, whatever you're negotiating, you need to really consult with allies. Really consult, not fly over, land, give a briefing, and leave. Actually, it's the listen as well as talk, and most importantly, don't surprise your allies. They can disagree, you can talk it out. Don't surprise them. That's really not good for alliances.
Thank you.
They shouldn't surprise us either. But
And my last question, what are you proudest of in your career?
I guess two things. One is, I guess professionally, the working with allies on whatever issue I was working on and trying to do just what I said, which is listen as well as talk, hear what they've got to say, not surprise them, keep them in the loop, look at it from their perspective. That's one thing. And the other is trying to support the people who worked for me at various levels. I mean, at NDU, I had research assistants and I had them in defense as well. Actually, the deputy secretary, who's just left, was a PMI in my office during the first nuclear posture review. So, whoever is working, you are senior too, and they're working with you, trying to support them and have their backs, not send them out on a limb that you're then going to saw off. Because I had bosses like that early in my career who support. They might have sent me away into an interagency group or an international meeting, and I didn't really know how far I could go, but they never cut the limb off under, never sawed off the limb, and they always had my back. And so I tried to do that with the people who worked for me too.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. Is there anything else you want to add? Anything you'd like folks to know? It's a changed world out there.
It is. And so whatever lessons we get from these interviews on arms control, you need to pick and choose what lessons apply and which ones don't. They don't all apply. It's not like we can tell you how to do this. Some of it you just have to figure out yourself because the context is different now. The players are different. The context is different. So take with a grain of salt what you hear. Pick the lessons you think apply and throw away the rest.
Terrific. Thank you, Elaine. It's been wonderful talking to you.
Thank you, Amy.